We're live, and we're going to be discussing an episode of Homicide called Gasman that actually has some good music in it, for once.
Okay, let's. Yeah, that depends on the audience, but that because the first thing that popped in my head even before we started doing this was the first song that plays as the episode opens. I was working my way back to you by the Spinners, so yes, the music is used. So regardless of whether one likes it or not. But The Gas Man is the season finale of the third season of Homicide: Life on the Street, originally aired on NBC on May 5th, 1995. The episode was written by Henry Brommel and directed by Barry Levinson. And the story focuses on Victor Helms, whose life has fallen apart while he was in prison, serving a 6-year sentence for negligent homicide. Victor had incorrectly installed a gas heater in a home, resulting in a leak that killed the entire family living there. Frank Pembleton was the primary investigator and key prosecution witness for the case against Victor. So when Victor is released from prison, he immediately seeks revenge. Spying on him with binoculars, breaking into his house to turn the stove on, light conversation with Pembleton's wife Mary in a grocery store, yet remains unsure of how to go about getting revenge. Frank and Mary, meanwhile, remain oblivious that Victor has been stalking them. At first, Victor thinks he's found an angle for revenge when he discovers Pembleton's secret, that Frank has been going to a fertility clinic in an attempt to get Mary pregnant. But he changes his mind when, in the process of stalking Pembleton, Victor and his friend Danny stumble upon a crime scene shortly before Pembleton arrives. Danny and Victor are initially horrified. The fortuneteller's head has severed, and the murder weapon, a large knife, to complicate Pembleton's investigation. Victor explains to Danny that his plan is to repeatedly tamper with the evidence at the crime scene in the hopes that the investigation will eventually become hopelessly confused and Pembleton. His plan starts to work, but Danny, who has come to respect Pembleton after observing the way he lives his life, walks away from Victor's. Unlike Victor, the detective takes responsibility for his own life and actions. Losing patience, Victor lures Pembleton into an abandoned building by calling in an anonymous tip on where Frank can retrieve the knife in the head. Victor takes Frank by surprise, putting the knife to his throat, but cannot bring himself to kill the detective. He breaks down in tears and is taken into custody.
Was that a little bit dumb of Pembleton to sort of walk into that situation?
Yeah. Pembleton doesn't always think things out before he does them. It's almost like it's a personality flaw. It would be a flaw, yeah.
I like this character as well. It was very Tarantino-esque. But you see, I never saw the films that influenced Tarantino that he was ripping off. You may have, Jeff.
Yeah, well, as I mentioned at the opening, this episode was directed by Barry Levinson. It was the second episode of Homicide he directed. Of course, Barry Levinson co-created the show, for anyone who doesn't know that. He directed the very first episode, Gone for Good, and this was a full, 2 seasons or whatever in between, And this episode obviously has a very different feel of really any other episode of Homicide, because it's the only one that really focuses mainly on the characters that are not the main characters of the criminals. And they actually wanted to go further than that and not have any dialogue by the main characters that could not be heard by the other characters in the episode, and present it were entirely from their point of view. As with a lot of things, the network rejected that, and they compromised on this, where the episode, but they still had scenes where they showed the main characters that just from the perspective of the other 2 guys. But like I said, they originally wanted to do it, and it says, I'm not entirely sure, how much of it is accurate, because what it says in this article, it refers to the DVD commentary, It says, according to the DVD commentary by director-producer Barry Levinson, NBC was on the fence about whether to renew Homicide for a fourth season. The show was earning critical acclaim but struggling in the ratings. Levinson claims the network led him to believe the show would be canceled and yet failed to give him a definitive answer. Levinson's decision to give the show's acclaimed regular characters minimal screen time was an act of defiance aimed at the network. That's not exactly what he says, as I recall, but there was a little bit of that. But it was more like he said, this may be my last chance to experiment with the format and still use these characters, so I want to tell this story and use this way to do it. So it wasn't just like it wasn't like it was entirely like a middle finger to the network or something. It was mainly like, they won't tell me for sure if this is the last episode, so if it is, telling this interesting story within the framework that I'm allowed to do it.
I'm surprised that the network broadcast it last.
Yeah,
maybe they're not Bruce's choice.
With other stuff.
Yeah, you know what I mean?
Yeah,
if they're going to mess with something, I would have thought they'd have messed with this and said, "Wait a minute, we can't end a season like this."
Yeah,
they'd want to do.
Yeah, they could. I guess they could have flipped this episode and Cullen to do that, but okay. So anyway, I don't know if you want me to read any reviews before you talk about or not. TV.com doesn't have it doesn't have.
Just one thing about
you. There are some other people.
Why is Frank going out and picking up what I think is a paper?
Why not?
Well, why isn't it delivered through his door?
Well, it's close to his door. It was probably delivered by a paper boy, like.
Why didn't they put it through the? Why didn't they put it
of his door?
Why didn't they put it through the letterbox?
Have you've never been a delivery boy, have you? On a newspaper? Never been.
Well, in England, you have to put the paper through the letterbox. It's probably the only example of service.
Is it legally required, Ben?
It's just what's expected. Because I used to do a newspaper.
Well, Ben, have you never seen any American TV boy in it though, throwing papers?
Oh yeah, but I just want to point out it's probably the only example where service is worse in the United States than in England when it comes to delivering of papers.
I don't know about that. I can't, but yeah, I mean that's obviously a very common thing. That the paper doesn't necessarily end up in the ideal place when the delivery boy is throwing it somewhere.
I used to see things like that with the paper boy going down the street at the back, just throwing it in the guy. I thought, the lazy bastard! If only we could do that. Yeah, we had to deliver it, and not only that is when you're doing it in winter, and your fingers get really cold, and the letterbox like clamp the end of the fingers. That was quite painful. I used to do that when I was about 12.
With actual post office deliveries, you're required to put it in a approved postal service box of some kind. Obviously, what those are vary depending on the.
Oh, and I'll mention this is the triangle because in socionics they decided to choose the triangle for intuition. Who's that shape? Well, it's a sort of a mystical shape, isn't it? The triangle. That when you've gone through your reviews and stuff.
Well, like I said, they don't. David B226 Morris doesn't have a review of this one, but there are other ones. I don't know if you wanted me to read any of.
Oh yeah, fine.
That. So I haven't pre-read these, so I don't know. But this one is by someone called Lynch One. Homicide's run, the writers would always divert from a regular episode format every once in a while to not get bogged down by formula. This would be done in episodes such as The Subway, Full Moon, Line of Fire, and a few others, but never would they divert as extraordinarily as they did in this episode. It's not very surprising that they only did this episode because they all thought they were going to get canceled at the end of the season. While many episodes would elevate guest stars for an episode, such as had been done, Williams, Vincent, and Tomlin Marcia Gay Harden-Moses Gunn. This is the only time that an episode would be done almost entirely from the guest actor's perspective, and brutal Kirby is completely up to the task in this episode. Helms is a recently released convict who has been sent away from installing a defective gas heater that wound up killing an entire family. The detective who put him away was our own Frank Pembleton. While away, Helms' wife committed suicide, and Helms sees himself as a victim and blames Frank primarily. Upon leaving prison, he is picked up by his best friend Danny Newton, played by Richard Edson. The first thing Helms does is have Danny take him to Frank's house, casually kissing his wife goodbye. There, Helms vows to kill Frank. Makes this episode seem very dark, but the episode in fact contains some of Homicide's best humor in the series' run, most of it coming from the hilarious back and forth conversations between Danny and Victor. Yeah, I disagree with this person on that. I don't think that was the best humor, but anyway. Take special notice of their argument over how they get the caffeine out of the coffee bean to make decaf coffee. How that Helms can exploit for his revenge, they begin tailing Frank and wind up at a crime scene where a gypsy fortune teller has been decapitated. They sneak around the building while Frank and Tim are interviewing witnesses and stumble upon his head. Victor decides to take it as a means of humiliating Frank. What makes the episode even more interesting is while two criminal masterminds are certainly making it up as they go along, very intimate things about Frank. For example, they discover he is seeing a fertility doctor because he's unable to get his wife pregnant. In a scene of devastating cringe humor, Frank is having his sperm count analyzed with a microscope, which projects a blank screen. Slowly you see one crawl by, and the doctor optimistically says, "Hey, we got one." Frank is not impressed. Surprisingly enough, Victor's plan ends up working pretty well. Frank arrests the real murderer at a restaurant, who promptly confesses, sending a tape of the head and the murder weapon to the local news station, making Frank and Homicide unit look ridiculous. Victor then makes it personal by confronting Frank's wife at the grocery store, making a thinly veiled threat and turning the gas on at their house so as to send a message. He leaves a message for Frank demanding he meet him alone. Frank obeys and arrives at a building lit up entirely with candles. In a devastating accident, actually gets the drop on him with a knife to Frank's throat, and he just vents all his anger out at Frank in an excellent monologue, but he's unable to kill him. If there's one thing even slightly disappointing about this episode, it's the regular cast isn't given much to do. Brower is the only one with significant screen time, and Secor has a few moments where it's shown that he and Pembleton are still very much at odds due to the previous episode events. The entire cast isn't seen until about 15 minutes into the episode. However, I'm going to skip that. It's a bit of a spoiler. Kirby and Edson carry this episode as the two criminal companions, and they develop a great camaraderie. Kirby finds just the right mix of patheticness, intellect, and anger. An early scene where he tries to explain well for the family. Edson is great as the pushover sidekick who near the end works at the nerve to tell Victor he's lost it, but still remains loyal to the end. The episode's director was the man himself, Barry Levinson, who came aboard when it was believed to be the series finale. Here he shows that knack for blue-collar comedy that he demonstrated in Tin Men and Diner. His being the director is even more ironic, seeing as how this episode probably used music more than any other episode in the show's run through Danny's appreciation of 70s pop songs, since one of his main points when he first came aboard the show was that he didn't want to use a lot of music. One of the most unique hours of television I've ever seen. His attitude that allowed them to make this episode might have been what ended up getting the show picked up for its fourth year, but I doubt it. What remains is probably the best season finale the show ever produced, my rating 10 out of 10. So that's his take.
Right, I made some notes. I'll just show. Right. The notes are, I like the music throughout the episode. Oh dear, look at that. Oh, that should be transition. Yeah, there's some good transition shots in this episode. Like, there's a bit where... what was that moving the camera down? It just seemed Quentin Tarantino-esque. But as you said, Barry Levinson... And then that discussion about coffee beans. And I agree with you where it's... I mean, I find other things more humorous. It was just I just noticed the... And it did... And that actor, does he remind you of Joe Pesci as well? don't know if I've got his phone now.
Maybe a little the character anyway, but I saw Bruno Kirby before I saw Joe Pesci, so again,
Right.
I'd say it's the other way around.
Right.
They both were in several gangster movies, so they both probably came from a similar point of view on that, maybe in terms of what characters that they tend to get cast in.
Yeah, it's also
But the first thing I saw Bruno Kirby in was actually the movie City Slickers, which was a comedy and not gangsters in the slightest. So.
And even then, I'll put that. You go on.
I was going to say Bruno Kirby would come back to direct an episode of Homicide later on. So obviously he his experience and decided to come back later, but not as an actor, but as a director.
Yeah, you'd think that rubbishy old American car would draw attention to itself. This one looked like it's from the 1950s or 60s. I'll put it on screen.
Well, I thought it looked very 70s, which was kind of the point. Is that when he says the line about Danny, like he's just stuck in the 70s, listening to the music, driving the same car, and which reminded me because I recently saw Guys, which was set. And to me, watching this episode, I saw an example of the flaws in that movie, because you have this episode, which isn't set in the late 70s, but has a character that sort of still is. He dresses to the music he listens to and everything, where you have that sense more effectively communicated in that than you have in an entire movie that's supposed to be set there. That to me was kind of telling when I saw that, because I was like, oh, obviously this isn't the first time I've seen this episode. This combination of Fontana and Levinson, their job than the writer-directors of that movie in portraying that trapped in the past kind of thing. So anyway, that's just a side note on that. But.
Oh yeah, it was something that Tarantino got praised for in Pulp Fiction. Or saying things, oh, it's so postmodern.
You and I both agree that Tarantino is overrated. So my favorite thing probably that he actually did was he wrote the screenplay to the movie True Romance, and that's probably my favorite movie that he's involved in, because even though it's kind of disjointed, it's a fun movie with a lot of good scenes in it. So, but yeah.
Yeah, and then I've got this bit at the end. I'll go back to the slide. This bit, because a running theme so far. This here. Has Pembleton's faith returned? Milk had nothing to do with it. God reached down and graced the fool with wisdom.
Yeah, and there's a lot of sort of moments in the course of the show where Pembleton has, his faith or his view of things kind of goes back and forth or jumps around in different ways. And was another one of the ways that I related to the characters. Some of the struggles he goes through are very similar to ones that I have in my life in terms of the way he views things. So I had such a strong relation to that announcement about God reached down and did this thing. At the same time, he has other. I try not to spoil future things, but to say in the previous episodes, he's said things about, well, I wear a bulletproof vest, so I don't obviously just put my faith entirely in God, and he has. The great thing about it is he tends to speak his mind, what's on his mind, and so you see the roller coaster of what he goes through and how he looks at things, and it doesn't always come across as consistent to other people because they don't understand what he's going through. But like I said, that was one of the strongest things I related to in him way before I knew anything about typology stuff. When he expressed things about his point of view, anything about people, I related to a lot of it. It was very similar to the way that I view things.
Yeah, because you watched Homicide at the time of broadcast, didn't you?
Yes. Although I'm not sure I actually saw this episode when it was first broadcast, because I watched all the episodes with Morgan. I really didn't remember this one. So I either didn't see it the first time or I just blocked it out. It just didn't make much of an impact because I really didn't remember it.
Maybe you thought that Pembleton was a bit lame in this episode, and that's why you blocked it out.
I don't know. The funny thing is watching this episode, if I had never seen Homicide before, and this was my introduction to it, I would feel very let down that Pembleton's not killed. Thing had to it that it was like, that seemed like a cop-out, that it was like, well, isn't actually ending, we're not sure it's going to end, so we can't kill off Pembleton where he can't kill him. To me, there's too much belief there for me. I feel like he would have done it. Even if he didn't actually succeed, I mean, he would have tried. Maybe he survives and they get him to the emergency room fast enough and he survives. But of course they didn't want to have to, deal with too much of a Pembleton recovery, I guess. But that was the thing. That was one of the few things that didn't ring true for me. He copped out at the end because it seemed like he was capable of doing it. He set everything up to do it, that he would have done it. So yeah, I love Pembleton and didn't wish for Pembleton to die, knowing him as a character in the show. If I take this as a standalone, isolated episode,
I think one of the reviews said that the actor did well, that Bruno Kirby did well in sort of the combination of maybe the character being the combination of incompetent, intelligent enough, and you just see him as a slightly incompetent character. And yeah, I thought it was a bit of a cop-out, but I thought the actor did well in that moment.
Yeah, I don't fault Bruno Kirby for that. I disagree with the writing choice. I think if you're going to have the incompetence come into play, like the knife slips out of his hands or something, where he doesn't actually get it up to Pembleton's neck, he drops it and he can't pick it up fast enough, Pembleton thwarts him again. That would sort of like present the idea that, it would sort of complete the pathetic picture of he's unable to, he does everything to set it up, but then he screws something up at the end. He suddenly has a conscience right in that scene. Of everything that was set up to lead it. There's no moment where I can believe that he changes his mind up to that point where it seems that he wouldn't have done it in that moment.
I didn't read it as conscience. I just read it as he's not capable of doing it. That he's almost like not tough enough to do it.
Yeah. I don't know. I felt like, again, if something went wrong at the last second, either he or something, he knocks over a candle and starts burning the place or something, there had to be some kind of was displayed other than just him finishing what he started like that. That to me, I didn't like that.
Yeah,
it seemed typical TV, as opposed to Homicide is not typical TV. And that moment, some of the dialogue between him and his friend also seemed that way. From the beginning, I realized they were taking and having those two being crux of the episode. And again, I talk about, how this wasn't the first episode of Homicide that I saw. If it was, in fact, from those first few scenes, because I didn't like the interactions at the start between those two. I just thought these are Bebop and Rocksteady type characters. I use that as a generic thing when you have the never learn anything and just have idiotic dialogue between each other. And that's how they came across. But actually, I don't know, because if I had just seen this one, again, but if I had seen this film without seeing Rest Homicide, I might not have felt that way strongly, because having watched Homicide and realizing how good the dialogue usually is, to have all of a sudden this thing with the two stooges, it kind of struck me as, what the hell are they doing here? So I was put off by that, but I think there's a lot of good elements to the episode in the way that it came off. It would be interesting to see if the original vision that they had for not having the characters have any other than the what those characters could hear. That would have been interesting to see, because as it is, it sort of comes off halfway. It's like they don't have them, but then they still have. Then they have a scene a little bit into the episode. They have the talking about the stuff sent to the and stuff. So it was a little weird that way. It seemed kind of inconsistent. I enjoy a lot of elements of this episode, but there's some things about it that kind of bug me. So it's unsatisfying in some ways to me.
Have you seen Revelation of the Daleks?
I did when I was a kid. It's been a long time, so I don't know anything about it, because I'm eventually going to watch it again. And so,
well, one of the criticisms of Eric Sayward was that he would do things like this, where he would come up with his own characters, and he would concentrate more on them. I don't think you've seen season 22 yet. Like Attack of the Cybermen, that kind of thing. You've not seen that either, have you?
In my recent viewing, which now is a few years ago, but I left off with the Twin Dilemma, so I haven't seen beyond that since I was a kid.
Well, I'll just say something about Eric Sayward. Is he did a magazine interview in about 1989, where he said that Colin Baker weren't a very good actor, and that John Nathan Turner was a sort of producer who'd go to a convention in America on the weekend, come back, and then sleep in his office on a Monday. And it was Eric Sayward who pushed to get Robert Holmes back into the series. And then, anyhow, we'll talk about that.
Bring us back to Homicide.
Yes.
Yeah, because I don't have much time left, so what I wanted to say about this episode.
I like the music. And yeah, it started to drag about like halfway through. Like, okay, we know the situation. The actors are doing a good job. It seems, and like I said, it seems. What's it called? Not Reservoir. Pulp Fiction-esque, and I'm not really a huge fan of that film, but it was okay when I saw it. It's got one good line, Pulp Fiction. I'm going to get medieval on your ass. It's about it.
I think it has more than that, but
in terms of like laugh out loud.
But back to well, I think a lot of Samuel L. Jackson's lines in that movie are funny, but I thought it was the scene with Bruno Kirby in the grocery store with Mary, very effectively creepy. That whole scene is, I mean, it achieves the what it's trying to do there, and the discomfort level is off the charts. Yeah. It's going around back in front of her face and saying just enough that he knows Frank, but then he starts saying things at the end to make her wonder who the hell is this guy. So well done.
Yeah, I don't know.
So, in to wrap up for me, I would say that it was a bold choice, a risky thing to do in making the episode this way. I think by and large it pulls it off, in that it does, it's interesting the way that they go about it. Overall enjoyment level, I would give it a 7 out of 10. And there's something very disappointing about it that I can't talk about yet, but I'll be able to after the next episode, after we start season 4.
Okay.
That's the most disappointing element, is that there's something that there's something that they missed an opportunity for, and I'll just leave it at that. So
okay.
That overall, I think it's a fun episode in some ways. I enjoy a lot of the elements. I did think the music was used effectively, and there's a lot of good things about it. and an effective setup of that final scene, just a little bit dissatisfying conclusion.
One thing I'll say about the music is that the songs, all of them were good singers. Even if the music was, I like the singing. Right, so I'll give it about 7. So it's goodbye for me.
And the next time we may do some sort of season 3 and review video. We'll talk about that later. But
yeah, and also Blake 7 season B review as well.
yeah, if we can figure out how to do that, we'll do that too. So next time, folks.
Yep.